Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be starting a new section, and this section is called the Romantic Era. The Romantic Era roughly stretches from 1815 to 1848. So, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at the economy first, as we normally do. And our question is, what was Adam Smith's theory on wealth creation? How would the early Industrial Revolution have contributed to wealth creation according to this theory? So hopefully you've read the section on Adam Smith and you are prepared and have some knowledge about what his theories are. So we're going to jump in with a little bit of a review of mercantilism. Mercantilism is a political philosophy that we've talked about. Now, if you don't quite recall mercantilism, one of the main ideas of mercantilism was that the amount of wealth in the world was fixed. Okay? Might be helpful to think of this as a pizza. If you and four of your friends are sitting around enjoying a pizza, and the pizza has 8 slices, and you get to your second slice, so that should have been the end of your portion, but then you take 2 more slices. Well, then obviously you've had 4 now. You've had 4 slices of pizza. There's only 8, means all of your friends now only get 1 slice. Why? Well, because there was only so much pizza, and you've taken half of it. All right. Mercantilists tended to think of the world's wealth in similar terms. There was only so much wealth in the world. And it's important to remember that many mercantilists thought of wealth in terms of gold and silver. All right. So if there's obviously only a finite amount of gold and silver. There's only so much gold and silver in the world. And that meant that if one country took more than its share, there was so much less for all the other countries. And of course, as a good king or as a good leader, you wanted to get your country the maximum amount of gold and silver. And so we saw that before. Some far-thinking diplomats, kings, leaders, they would enact policies that would make sure that their country maximized the amount of gold and silver. All right, so they would try to limit imports, right? Because if you're importing a lot, it means that you're buying a lot from other people, which means gold and silver are exiting the country. And they would try to maximize exports. Because again, if people are buying stuff from you, your country, things that you produce, that meant gold and silver were coming in. Okay, and so these were some of the goals of mercantilism. And if you think that the amount of wealth in the world is determined by the amount of gold and silver there is, then these policies might make sense. Well, as we look at Adam Smith, we're going to see that Adam Smith has a different view of what wealth is. Adam Smith says, yes, it's true that if you look at a wealthy person, they do tend to usually have gold and silver in the bank. All right. But he says money is not real wealth. Gold and silver are maybe nice to look at, but they're not really anything. They have really no useful function. All right. Other than as a method of exchange. And so much less so for the money we use, right? It's just, if you think about it, it's just really paper. It's no value in and of itself. It's just a medium of exchange. Just because other people will accept this paper and give you stuff that you want, that's why it's valuable to you. Other than that, it wouldn't be very valuable. All right. And so true wealth then is measured in goods and services. And we can think about this, right? If somebody had 3 houses with pools in the backyard, a yacht, private jet, and I don't know, diamond rings. We would say that that person is a pretty wealthy person. What if you found out that the same person only had, say, $1,000 in the bank, right? We would still consider that person wealthy, especially if their neighbor, let's say, only had one house and it was a small house. And he was driving an old beat up car, but he had $10,000 in the bank. Well, it's pretty obviously we would say, well, yeah, of course, the one guy has 10,000, the other guy has a thousand in the bank. The other guy has a lot more wealth because he has houses and cars and so on. And so the point of all this is to understand that Adam Smith reinterprets the way we think of wealth. Wealth is based off of goods and services. Well, the question then is, if wealth isn't just based off of gold and silver, but goods and services, well, we can make goods and services, right? We can't really make gold and silver. People have tried and you can't do it. But you can make goods and you can produce services. And so this led Adam Smith to come up with something called the labor theory of value. Adam Smith said that it's actually labor that adds value to something. Okay? So in other words, you can think of this maybe in something simple. If you had a pile of sheep hair sitting in your house, probably not worth very much to you. Probably get the dust buster out and try to vacuum it. But if you were skilled, and let's say this sheep hair was cashmere, which I don't even know if it's a sheep, but anyways, let's just say it's cashmere. And you took this and you made a cashmere sweater out of it. You took your skill, you took your labor, and you made a cashmere sweater out of it. Well, then suddenly, this would be much more valuable than a big pile of hair, right? This would be an expensive sweater. Essentially, what Smith said you've done in this case is you've added your labor to this raw material and you've made it more valuable. Okay? And Smith said we do this all the time. We take raw materials and we make them more valuable. You may say, okay, so what's the point here? Well, the point is if wealth is based off of goods and services, and we can add more value to these things, then the amount of wealth on earth is not fixed. In other words, we can continuously add more wealth. We can add more value to things by applying our labor. All right? So the amount of wealth can grow on earth, right? We're not stuck. And Smith noticed something else, and this is kind of important for our current discussion, is the amount of labor that we can add to something can be greatly enhanced by using tools and machines. By using tools and by using machines. And so the amount of wealth on earth isn't fixed. We can create wealth by adding labor to it, and we can greatly increase our labor by using machines. And so this means that if we could get proper machines, if we get better tools and more machines, then we could continuously be adding wealth and we can continuously be adding value, Smith taught. All right. And so this is kind of a revolutionary idea. This kind of breaks the mold a bit from mercantilism. Mercantilism with its fixed wealth and this labor theory of value that says wealth is measured in goods and services and we can enhance our ability to do this. This could be a world of abundance, Smith thought. Now, Smith is writing in 1776. And he's writing right at the beginning of something called the Industrial Revolution. And he's noticing that there's already at his time, even though the major part in the Industrial Revolution would be a couple of decades later, he's noticing at his time there's some important changes going on. One of the areas that he saw important changes occurring is in textile manufacturing. We've talked quite a bit about textiles, and textiles are probably after food one of the most important things to humans, right? We think food, clothing, and shelter, kind of necessities. We saw in an earlier lecture that people did begin to manage their food supplies better. But after food, textiles was a major concern of people. Everybody needs clothing. And especially if you live in a cold northern climate like Smith's Britain. Now, there's some critical areas in the process of textile manufacturing. There's a lot of steps, but one of the most critical areas is called the spinning process. This is essentially where you take a bunch of wool and you turn it into thread. Now, earlier, there were a couple of simple tools like the spinning wheel. And essentially, what the wheel does, based on my rudimentary understanding of it, is you pedal it with your foot and it twists this hair and basically turns it into thread, which is the basic substance of a textile, of clothing. Well, in the early 1700s, a couple of decades before Smith writes, there was a big bottleneck in the spinning, in the textile manufacturing process. And the bottleneck was during spinning. Apparently, it takes quite a long time to turn a pile of sheep hair, wool, into thread. And no matter how hard people tried, worked hard, worked fast, worked diligently, there just was not enough thread to satisfy the demand of many of the weavers at this time. Remember, England was increasingly supplying much of the world, much of its colonies with manufactured goods, right? Particularly textiles. And it wasn't just wool, but cotton too. Remember, we said England had these colonies all over the world. It had interests in Africa. It had the Caribbean, India. And England was increasingly selling to these people. And so it had a big market, and there was a real demand for this thread. Okay? But the woman, typically this was women who did this, the women who were doing this couldn't keep up with this demand. All right? And so a man by the name of James Hargreaves in 1765 came up with an interesting, simple machine. And this machine was called the spinning jenny. And the way it worked is you crank this wheel, and this wheel turned 7 spindles. All right, spindles is where you wound the thread onto. And so by cranking this wheel, it meant that one person could do the job of 7. All right, so it greatly enhanced the productivity of a spinner. All right, so now you just crank the wheel and you're doing the job of 7. Well, there were some limitations on this. You may say, well, why just 7? Well, that was about as much as a normal person could turn with their arm. Remember, you're doing this all by hand. Any more than that, and it was just too much pressure on one person's arm. I can already imagine you probably ended up with a pretty big shoulder in one arm and a withered one on the other. Well, anyway, so 7 was about the limit that a person could turn. And plus, I can imagine that a lot of people were probably complaining about carpal tunnel and pinches in their neck, and it was probably not the best job in the world. And so a few years later in 1770, a man by the name of Richard Arkwright came up with an invention called the water frame. And essentially, what the water frame did, well, let me just show you this first. So, the spinning jenny allowed a person to do the work of 7. The water frame was turned by a gigantic water wheel. Okay? So, the second invention in 1770 was turned by a water wheel. And this meant that, well, water wheels are a lot stronger than people are. And it meant that instead of having 7, you could have, oh boy, my slide is off here. You could have 100. All right, so I don't know why this slide didn't upload properly, but anyways, you can imagine that based on maybe what you can see here, there's now 100 spools that are being turned. All right, and this meant that one person could do the job of 12 or so people on a spinning jenny. All right. And of course, each spinning jenny could do the job of 7 of those. So in other words, these water wheels, these water frames, excuse me, allowed the one machine to do the job of 100 people. All right. One machine could now do the job of 100 people. Well, as you might be able to surmise, this kind of led to a different place in the bottleneck, right? Now there's plenty of thread to go around. If you're a weaver, that's the next step, where you take these threads and turn it into a textile. Well, these are happy days for you. Plenty of thread, plenty of work. You don't have to worry about work stoppage anymore. In fact, the problem is that there was not enough weavers. Weavers couldn't keep up. Well, if you guessed that someone came up with a way to mechanize weaving, then you're right. The power loom was invented in 1784 by a man named Edmund Cartwright. But the power loom had some early problems, and it really wasn't until the early 1800s that the power loom really became functional. Once it did, though, this meant that you could set up a loom, and all you had to do is set the thing up with the thread, walk away from it, and come back in a couple of hours, and you have a nice roll of cloth. They're called bolts. Giant bolt of cloth. All right? And so what this meant between water frames and between power looms was that the textile process was now mechanized from start to finish. Okay, you bring in wool, you bring in cotton on one end, process it through these machines, and at the other end, you're coming out with a bolt of thread ready to go and be sent to Africa or the Caribbean or wherever it happens to be sold. Okay. Obviously, greatly enhance the efficiency, greatly enhance the productivity, all of those things. All right. Well, there were some limitations on this, though. And one of the big limitations was obviously that for all of this to work, you needed to have a water frame, a water wheel. And a water wheel obviously requires a river, and not just any river. It has to be a river that's flowing properly. It can't be a slow-moving river. It can't be too fast. It has to be the right depth. Rivers are known to fluctuate. They vary. Sometimes they're dry. Sometimes they freeze. And so they're less than ideal sources of power. And so we're going to pick up another thread, if you'll pardon the pun, of the Industrial Revolution, and that's the use of fossil fuels. Now, if you know your British geography, you'll know that Britain is an island. And as an island, that means it has fairly limited space. And as Britain's population grew in the 14 and the 1500s, Britain started to face a real problem. It started to run out of trees. You start cutting down trees, you have to get them further and further away. People didn't understand forest management back in these days, and so Britain started to run out of trees. Well, like I said, Britain's a pretty cold country in the winter, and people would freeze if they didn't find a new energy source. And so they began to turn to coal. Already by 1500, many Londoners were heating their homes with coal. Well, coal at first was a great source because, well, there was coal lying around. Um, you know, go by, certain areas, it's like a rock almost. You get this coal and you just burn it. Great energy source. But soon, all of the coal on the surface was used up, and people had to start digging deeper and deeper and into mines in order to solve their energy needs. Well, there's a problem here again. And the problem is when you dig a hole and you dig one of these mine shafts, there's underground water. There are rivers underground. And what will often happen is these coal pits that you dig would fill with water. All right. And then you'd go into your mine and it would be flooded. Well, at first people would do probably the bucket brigade or a hand pump of some sort, but as they got deeper and deeper and more water in the mines, people started to search for an alternative. And one of the alternatives they came in was using a simple engine. And the engine would power a simple pump. All right. Now, unfortunately, this pump is not animated. The particular program we're using here doesn't show it. But if you can imagine, you've got the boiler on the right here. And what the boiler will do is the boiler will push up a piston, right? So the steam will push up a piston, which will force the pump down. The pump will go down, the steam will be released, and the pump will come back up and boils up again, and steam pushes the piston up again, and this goes on back and forth, and you use this simple steam engine to pump out your water mines. And it's good because you're already near a coal pit, so the energy source, which is coal, is readily available. And people started to experiment with these simple machines in the early 1700s. Well, these early machines were pretty inefficient, and they were okay for pumps, but they didn't have much application other than that. It wasn't going to be until the 1760s that a man named James Watt, a Scotsman, just to the north of England, created the first practical steam engine. And essentially what this did is it added a crank. We won't get into what cranks are, but they're a way for you to turn this back and forth motion of the piston into rotary motion. The crank turns back and forth motion. A piston is just this this plunger-like thing that is moved by steam engine. It just goes back and forth. But you want to turn this linear motion into rotary motion. It'll have much more application, so you add a crank to it. His engine was also more efficient, and so now people had a way of creating rotary motion. So, if you're thinking ahead here, you may say, aha, rotary motion. What can we do with rotary motion? Well, we can turn it into, we can use it instead of using these water wheels. We can use the power of coal, the power of steam, and we don't have to rely on water wheels anymore. All right. And so the big advantage of this is now you can build mills wherever you want to build them. You can build them next to population centers, so you have plenty of workers. You can run these mills. Doesn't really matter the weather. You're not contingent on if it's dry, if it's cold. You don't have to stop production. You can move these mills next to the population centers, or maybe next to the boats that are going to send them out all over the world. The beauty of this is you have this almost unlimited source of energy, and you can now begin to apply it to your textiles or whatever else you think of. Whatever machine you can create, you can now move it by the power of coal. Well, this is going to lead to a big reorganization of labor. Now, if you think about it, up until this time, labor had been done in the homes of peasants. We call this cottage industry, or the putting out system. And so peasants would have these simple tools in their house. Usually the wife would spin, the husband would weave, and you'd be in your little cottage in the countryside having a great time. Well, this was great, but as we know, not as efficient as working by machine. And so as these machines became bigger and more complex, as you needed a power source, working in the peasant home became untenable, really. So, some of these machines were very expensive. They cost thousands of dollars to make. They were large, too large to put inside someone's home. And obviously, you're not going to have a little coal engine outside of every peasant's home. It's just impractical. And so, if you guessed that labor was going to have to move out of the cottage and into the factory. And so factories were created. All right. So this had the advantage of bringing all phases of production together. In other words, you could have raw wool or raw cotton come in on one end and bolts of cloth come out the other end. You could have one or two steam engines that were going to operate many, many different machines. You brought all people together, and it made more sense. Now, obviously, this was going to require a pretty big investment, though, to build this gigantic house, gigantic factory, was going to require a lot of money. And so the mill owner would have to put up this money, right? The guy, the investor, he would put up the money to build this gigantic factory. He'd have to put up the money to buy the machines, right? The peasants aren't going to bring their own machines in, to build steam engines. So this is going to buy the land. This was going to be an incredible outlay of money. But the thinking is once you start making profits on this, then these will pay more than pay for themselves, hopefully. It's a pretty expensive undertaking. Now, something we're going to talk about in a bit, I just want to mention here, is this kind of changed the nature and the relationship of labor to what some economists call the means of production. All right. If we think of what the factors of production are, there's a couple of things we need to produce things. We need raw materials, cotton in this case. We need a place to build it. That would be land of some sort, right? You have to build it somewhere. You have to manufacture it somewhere, excuse me. You need machines. Economists would call that capital investment. Raw materials, land, machines. Oh, and one other thing, labor. Okay. Now, typically, peasants had much of this, right? They had personally possessed most of this. Peasants had, owned the land. They had owned the tools that they were using, the machines, if you will. The only thing that they were being supplied with was the raw material, and peasants had applied their own labor to it, and they would sell it back to the merchant capitalist. But now the factory owner owns everything, right? He owns the land, he owns the house, the facility that it's being built in. He owns the machines, the tools. He owns the raw materials. The only thing that the laborer now possesses is his own labor. Okay, and so this means that the common person now only shows up, and he only gets paid a simple wage. It's not like before, where you're a skilled craftsperson. Okay, well, this was all going to have an incredible effect. The fact that Britain could become so productive now meant that, unlike its competitors, the British were going to really become the workshop of the world. So, raw materials, here's raw cotton consumption. You can see that Britain, even though it was a pretty small country, it was using way more than any of its neighbors. And that's because it was producing so much. It was producing for the entire world. If you look at coal production, right? The coal that was not only heating homes, but also firing the engines of industry, Great Britain produced something like 70% of the world's coal. All right. All other countries only use 30%. And that's because Britain had jumped out to such a lead in raw materials. If you look at steel or iron production, which is represented here, Britain was using way more iron, and its iron needs were increasing as industrialization took off. And if you look at the productivity of the British, Britain's population did grow, but not anywhere near as fast as this. It was just that each individual worker was now becoming more and more productive, and Britain was producing more and more goods, and it was producing more and more services, and it was really becoming the workshop of the world. All right. Now, Britain's population in 1800 was about 2% of the world's population, or in 1850, I think this is. In 1850, Britain had about 2% of the world's population. All right. Now, if all things were equal, if Britain had, just a regular workforce, then we would expect it to do 2% of the world's production. But Britain didn't have a regular workforce. It had a workforce that was using these tools and using these machines that were powered by coal. And so Britain was producing something like 25, 24% of all the world's production was done in tiny little Britain, making it really, as I said, the workshop of the world, the industrial powerhouse of its age in the early 1800s. Now, I want to show how this affects things. You say, okay, so you're more productive. What does this all mean? Why are we so focused on productivity? Well, this is a modern day 2018 graph here. And I want to show you how this works. So if I were to ask you, which country is richer, China or the UK? Well, it would depend on what I meant by richer. If you're talking about overall production, China is richer. Okay, so if you look at this top line here, it says GDP. GDP is gross domestic product, and that's a measure of all the goods and services that are produced. This is one of the primary tools that a economist will use. And so if you look at GDP, the US produces $18.6 trillion worth of goods and services. That means if you add up every single citizen and every single worker in the United States, they produce $18.6 trillion worth of wealth, making the United States the wealthiest country on earth in that terms. If you look at China, China is the second richest country, and China produces $11.2 trillion. And they're growing fast. So they're growing their wealth, their productivity is growing faster than ours. So they may overtake us at some point. Britain is somewhere around the fifth wealthiest country on earth, and they produce $2.6 trillion American dollars worth of goods and services. Okay. However, if you look at the populations, this tells a different story, right? So the US has about 323 million people. China has 1.3 billion people, and Britain has 65 million people. So China produces a lot, but it has a lot of people, okay? And so there's a third line, and the third line is gross domestic product per capita. And what this means is what you do is you take the top line, gross domestic product, and you divide it by the population. And when you do that, it tells you that the average person in the United States creates about $57,000 worth of wealth. That's about probably what the average person in the US makes, about $57,000. If you do the same with China, China has a huge economy, but because it has a huge population, it also has it also kind of disperses all of that wealth, right? And so because there's so many people, that $11 trillion doesn't look so great anymore because the average person in China makes about $8,000. And if you look at the UK, the average person makes $39,000. And so by this metric, the UK is richer than China, right? You can see China, the average Chinese person only makes about $8,000 a year, where the average Brit makes about $40,000. Now, why is this? Well, it's because the average Brit is much more productive because of the machines and because of their productivity. Okay, and so the average Brit is far more productive than the average Chinese is. And because of that, Britain has a higher standard of living, right? Each person in Britain, when they go to work, they produce much more at work because of their tools, because of their machines. All right. And so there's a couple of different ways of slicing this up. And I hope that you can see that productivity, the productivity of a workforce, is incredibly important for determining how wealthy that particular country is going to be. Okay? The thing that makes the United States such a wealthy country, or one of the things, is that our workforce is so productive. All right? Because of our computers, because of our machines, because of all of the tools that we have, makes our country wealthy. And so this is something that many economists look at when they are figuring out which countries are growing and which countries aren't growing, right? It's good that your country overall, like that China's overall wealth increases, but what they would really want to do ideally is to add more machines, more tools, more software, whatever is going to make their workforce more productive, because then their GDP per capita, each citizen will live better. Okay. What I'd like you to do is I would like you to take what you've read in the Adam Smith handout and take what you've learned in this particular lecture, and I'd like you to take them and use it to answer this question. What was Adam Smith's theory on wealth creation? How would the early Industrial Revolution have contributed to wealth creation according to this theory?